Hello and welcome to the 6th week of our class. We're getting near to the end, aren't we? The 8 weeks really flies by. The topic that we're discussing this week is the idea of Christian mythology. And I've included some assigned readings on this topic, and I hope to kind of tie some of those ideas together in this short lecture. But the idea of Christian mythology probably strikes you as being strange. A lot of times we associate mythology with paganism, for example. So we've got the great myths of the ancient Greeks, for example. We've got the Odyssey, the Iliad. The ancient Romans, for example, have the Aeneid. But the idea of a myth is that it's a story, it's a grand narrative, if you will, that gives an entire body of people an identity, okay? And so for the Romans, for example, they took this mythical story of the Aeneid, and in it they found their identity, they found their origins, they found, in the story of this man going on this journey and founding the city of Rome, they find all of this meaning that they apply to their own lives, and they find virtue and heroism and courage, and they find that they are the good guys and the Greeks were the bad guys, and they find all of these things, right? Well, we do similar things in Christianity. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who we've looked at a couple of times throughout this course already, really honed in on this aspect of Christianity. And C.S. Lewis would famously say that Christianity is the one true myth. All right? So myth, or mythos, is something that is not necessarily false, okay? Using this idea of the imagination that we've already explored. Mythos is something that can put us in touch with our real circumstances, and it can give us a part in a larger picture. But what Lewis discovered is that Christianity has all of these mythical components. It's a backstory that gives meaning to our lives, but it also happens to be historically true. And that's really what floored him about Christianity, is he realized that this mythical story, which is perfectly written, the gospel story, Lewis said this is a perfectly written myth. J.R.R. Tolkien uses the term of eucatastrophe, right? Like a euphemism is a nice word that really refers to something that's bad. Well, a eucatastrophe is a good ending to something that is otherwise catastrophic, right? And so he says that the Christian story is a eucatastrophe. It's something that builds up to what seems like a terrible end in the death of Jesus, but then with the resurrection, it paints a totally different story of total blessedness and total happiness and total success of Jesus's role, right? And so with Christian mythology, we can use it as an opportunity to find meaning to the individual parts of our lives or of, for example, church's teaching by fitting it into a big picture, right? And so Lewis and Tolkien thought that was the best way to evangelize, is to introduce people into this grand Christian myth and then let them experience not only its beauty, but then also to find that it also happens to be true. It's not made up like the Odyssey or the Iliad or the Aeneid. This is a true story that can give a far more powerful mythological mechanism, if you will, to the people that adhere to it. Okay, so Christians are bound to the Christian myth in a far more powerful way than the Greeks were ever bound to their myths, or the Romans were ever bound to their myths. The Christian myth is one that totally gives order to our lives, order that's coherent, right? If you read the Greek and Roman myths, they're inconsistent, right? They don't really give a person a clear map of how they're supposed to live in the world. The Christian myth does, okay? It gives us a perfect example of what we're supposed to be doing, and it gives us hope for the future, right? So I've included a couple of links to some articles about Christian myth. But I also wanted to introduce a kind of unique flavoring of that idea presented to us by a man by the name of René Girard. And I included one article by Girard himself and then another commentary on the Hunger Games movies by Bishop Robert Barron, and he talks about Girard. And I think that really, and I think I also linked an article by Bishop Barron on Girard. So hopefully reading those three things can help you understand what we're talking about here. But what Girard said was that the Gospels really turn the original cultural myth on its head and gives it a totally new flavor, right? It reminds me of what Tolkien said about eucatastrophe, that Girard identified that cultures tend to create myths for themselves, and he said that the Christian kind of worldview is no different, that the Christianity kind of falls into the same rhythms as the rest of the world. And so he identifies, and I won't go into great detail about it, but what Girard says is that we all have these rivalries between each other. So let's say this represents a person, and this is another person, and this is another person. This whole community, right, of us living together and fighting and being jealous and all desiring the same things. And so we have all these rivalries amongst ourselves. And he says what cultures tend to do is they tend to then focus all of our internal rivalries on a third party. Okay, so we just project all of that on somebody else, who he calls the scapegoat. All right? And so you see this mechanism working in lots of human cultures. But what Girard says is that what the resurrection of Jesus teaches us is that that can't work anymore. All right? Jesus is scapegoated by his contemporaries, says Girard, and I think you can see some very telling points in the gospel that show that that kind of mechanism is working here. But he says the resurrection overturns all of that old way of thinking, is that cultures used to think that if we just can focus our contempt on this other scapegoat, then everything will be okay. Right? We see this really clearly in the Passion of Christ, particularly with the crowning of thorns and their parading of Jesus through the streets with the purple cloak, the fact that he's identified as the King of the Jews on the cross. Long before the advent of Christianity, there has been a tendency in world cultures to have a mock king, if you will. That's one of the things that it's been called over throughout history, is a mock king. So when the people are upset, they create a mock king, and they maybe burn him in effigy. You see that sometimes of people like making a stick figure and then burning it and kind of pretending like focusing all this violence against this made-up person is going to make everything better, right? Or you see them do it with human sacrifice. You see them actually slaughtering people as a way to appease their gods, right? You see the scapegoating thing happening. Well, this is sort of what's going on with Jesus, I think, and that's what Girard argues, is that the Jews and the Romans are scapegoating Jesus to try to hold their community together. They say, well, this Jesus is causing all these problems. If we can just focus our violence on him and make him go away, destroy him, then we'll move on and we'll feel justified by that, okay? Because that's what tends to happen in this mechanism, is that once the scapegoat is destroyed, everybody feels justified. They say, well, I guess he was meant to be destroyed. He deserved to die. And that's what the Jews thought about Jesus, right? They said he deserves to die because he's committed blasphemy. We see this, interestingly enough, as I was rereading A Man for All Seasons that you've just read. This exact same thing happens in Man for All Seasons. I've included the text of a short conversation that hopefully you remember between Cromwell and Rich. And this is essentially what Cromwell says. He says that King Henry wants either Thomas More's approval or he wants his death. And Rich is kind of confused by that. He said, well, how can he want both of those things? Cromwell says, well, it really doesn't matter, because if he approves of him, then everything's good. Or if he destroys him, then everything's fine, because it will appear that he was meant to be destroyed. It will appear that he deserved to be executed. And then people will say, well, he was just a traitor. The king didn't need his approval anyway. He was just a traitor, right? So we get that same thing going on with Jesus. When Jesus is raised from the dead, it's proved that he's innocent, though. So all those that felt justified in condemning them have to rethink it, and the whole world has to rethink this story now, according to Gerard. All right, so kind of the C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien idea of Christian mythology as something that plugs us into this bigger picture, and it gives us meaning, and it is attractive. It gives us a framework from which to act, and then you add what René Girard says about this changing of the myth, and I think it provides lots of food for thought, and it really makes the Christian story come alive as we read it and as we try to live it out. All right, so enjoy your reading, and good luck on your discussion boards, and we'll see you next time.